I'm pretty excited about this podcast I feel like I can call you a friend, right,
Yes.
Rico? For those who may not know, can kind of encapsulate why you're the subject matter expert, what we're going to talk about around the AI topic.
My background started in the military, working with behavioral science, communication, interaction, and things of that nature. That's how I was introduced to how to communicate, soft skills, things of that nature. And then I came into the civilian world and tried to approach that into the business world. And I met some amazing human beings that were already subject matter experts, like Dr. Robert Rome, an individual that connected both of us, Joe Peachy, in two different worlds. And that changed my life. And what's interesting about that is that I never intended it to ever be in behavior, training, facility. That was not even in my realm. I own two companies, and that was not something I ever thought of doing until, of course, I had a daughter. And my daughter was in middle school. And here you are. I'm a communication expert. So I understand behavior, the science, the neurology, everything of it. But no matter what I did, it would always end up in an argument with my daughter. When she would come home from school, it'd be a drag out fight. And this went on for a long time. And that's when I met Dr. Robert Rome, who helped me to understand what true behavior is, but more importantly, the science and data behind that. That's when I was introduced to assessments. We never used assessments back then.
Yeah.
And he quickly showed me the difference between me and my daughter and what was causing the friction. But more importantly, what do I need to do to make the changes to avoid all this? And it was instant, Paul. I mean, all he said was, do this, do this, do this, and you should see this reaction. That's exactly what it was. And I was hooked after that. So we sold our companies, and I dedicated and worked with Dr. Robert Rome, worked with Joe Peachy, and really understood the science. What is that data? Because there's assessments all around the world, but there are very few that are very accurate or really take a human approach. And once I saw that change in my daughter and our relationship to this day, I wanted to apply that into the business world. So I started utilizing that in marketing. I started utilizing that in sales and looking at the human element. My first book, The Client Nation, was all about that, understanding the customer's perspective in the sales process. But how do we use behavioral analytics to train other people on how to approach, how to communicate, how to recognize? And that's been my career. And now come AI. We've spent the last 2.5 years building our own behavioral analytics engine, taking every science that we've done for the last, I say 28 years. I've been all around the world, worked for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and bringing a unique insight into what is the human element in the workplace. And finally, you're starting to hear that that's become, let's focus on the employee. Let's focus on quality of life. Let's talk about psychologically safe. We've been talking about that for over 20 years, but now we can really use analytics to help understand the human experience in the workplace. So for the last 28 years, that is what we've been doing. We're constantly using data to reinforce, to educate, to design better approaches to hiring, to team performance, to how do you promote the right person? And more importantly, how do you avoid losing your top talent? I'm still amazed to this day, Paul, that we are still hiring the same way we've always hired and wonder why we keep losing. I mean, Gallup poll just came out. 68% of most employees still leave their job for the exact same reason they've always left.
Yeah.
And it's because we're not thinking about the human element at the very beginning.
A couple things I'm going to extract from what you said, if that's fair. First thing, it's funny you mentioned the story about your daughter. My daughter, who I love both my kids, equally. I think there was a speaker once who said oh, well, I love one of you a little bit more than the other, but I'm not going to tell you which one. But I'm kind of going through the same thing. So I totally connect with you on that. Now, you also scratch the inner nerd within me. Let's frame it from this perspective. So my wife and I were at the dinner table and just reading the headlines. One of the headlines were people are scared to talk about AI because number one, there's a fear that if they're using AI, it means they're incapable of their work performance. So that's fear number one we talk about at the dinner table. through like all the stuff we read. And then fear number two is if you're not using AI, then there's a lack of you not staying on top of technology. And when I say you, obviously I'm talking hypothetical here.
Sure.
So it becomes kind of this weird like pinch point for my wife and I. What is gray and what's really black and white? And I think since you're close to it, I was wondering if you can kind of bridge some of those gaps. Like if you were at that dinner table with my wife and I having that conversation, where could you layer in like educational value, what you're seeing, and to kind of demystify some of those fears and what's really true here?
I think that is the biggest topic of conversation across everything, right? And the best way I've heard it explained was this: when you go back to there was there's this picture of New York City before the car and then after, same street. And before the car, all you saw was horse and buggies. So the horse is
Yeah.
going, we're safe, we're good. There's nowhere, nothing's going to replace us. Then you see the car. And it was the exact same thing. When the car came out, everyone's like, that's never going to work. It's not going to replace the horse. And it did. Then you keep going. Now you look at, remember the giant brick phones? We would have never thought that that would lead to what we have today and how dependent we are into those things today. It didn't change who
Yeah.
we are. It didn't change, the things that are important to us. In some ways, it made it more convenient, and in some ways, probably a lot more difficult. What I see in the workplace is there has to be a very clear understanding of the application of those tools. Right now, most people would probably struggle to tell me 5 phone numbers of important people off the top of their head. What you've rewired your brain to do is know where the numbers are on your phone.
Yeah.
Where before you would have certain numbers already locked in your head. If you're old enough, you remember that you'd have to use a paper map to get from point A to point B if you didn't know where you're going.
Right.
Now you put your GPS to go 5 miles to the restaurant down the street. So the fear is true because what ends up happening is we start losing the skill and ability that is innate versus how do I use a tool to make it simple? And it has to be that balance. So what I tell our organizations is, how are we going to use this not only responsibly, but to enhance or
Okay.
improve productivity of the current workforces? And
Yeah.
then how can we use those tools to help certain employees reskill? Because it makes more sense to have technology take over the mundane, which now allows this talented individual to do other things more important because
Okay.
now there's there. It really comes down to being very cautious and very aware of do not give up your natural skill. How do you enhance that skill? And when we designed our behavior AI, his name is Remy, it
Okay.
was for that. So you and I know that, we use reports for everything, right? There's Myers Briggs, there's DISC, there's Strength Finders, you name it. And the reason we designed it is that we would go into some of these companies and say, we've used these 5 different companies and these reports. It gave us this much information. Now what? I'm like, well, that's everywhere I'm going. And I've done it myself. If
Yeah.
we're not there, we can't break down that information, how to use it. So what we designed was how do we take all of that data, that's important data that just seems chaotic, and put it into a chat GPT of workforce, if you will, and be able to interact with it. Now, as a leader, I say, I'm going to go talk to Paul. He's
Yeah.
not performing very well. What's the best approach to have a confident conversation or a productive conversation where it would be trial and error? So we can create a
Yeah.
shortcut for that. But the fear is real because there's so much unknown. And the difference between, say, like I said, the horse and the car, or the
Right.
phone, or even the internet, it's the
Correct.
speed. By the time we get used to something, 20 other things have occurred.
Yeah.
And we're getting to the point where there's a balance between give up everything
Right.
and let the automation take over, or how do I use it to enhance where I'm at? And I think that's a discussion that's going to continue. But if we don't take a step back and say, how can we use these tools responsibly for the enhancement or improvement of our workforce or who we are as
Right.
an individual? we're going to lose our sense of self because just like with the phone and phone numbers, you become really dependent. And that's really the discussion right
That was really powerful. Have you ever seen this show, Parks and Rec? Ever heard of it?
now.
Know of it? There's a scene, I forget the actor's name, but he uh he asks the guy because he takes away his phone and he goes, "Hey man, you're like 2 hours late to work and you only live like 5 minutes away." And he goes, "Yeah, it's because I didn't have my Google Maps." Like that's what I thought of instantly when you're talking about that. I'm gonna frame this next question with something that literally happened today. So, somebody who's been in technology forever, very hesitant person around AI. And he lives by the quote that just because something can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And I say that, Rico, to say sometimes it feels like there's so much AI popping up. It's almost to the point where it's overwhelming. At Generac, where I work, one of the things I learned was that it takes 17 times more power just to use AI over just like a Google search. I'm really trying to find the pain because you're a sales trainer, communication trainer. I think you'll understand, many people will understand this frame of like, I know there's a lot of AI, but here are some small things we should be doing now to be ready for these changes as they come. Does that word salad kind of give you clarity, or does that confuse you at all? Because I know I get excited and I talk too much sometimes.
No, I think that's a very important question to ask because I think what's occurring, there's a couple of things we need to look and give context towards that. When you look at the labor force itself, there's a couple of big challenges that are happening as to why AI is predominant, but also why there's concern. Number one, you have the baby boomer market almost outside of the workforce. And what most people don't realize is that that was the largest workforce in US history. They are now coming out, which means that every next generation is smaller. We're not having kids as often as the baby boomers, hence the name. Workforce has now been compartmentalized between face to face or if you are working from home because of
Yeah.
technology allowing that to happen. And
Right.
then you have a multi generational workforce. And with every
Okay.
younger generation, their native language is technology, which means less social skills, more intellect into how to use this technology. Again, hence the speed. As you see baby boomers reach out, and as you see leaders now being promoted from Gen X to millennial, millennial to Gen Ys, you're going to have to see technology taking a prominent step forward. Not because it's more cost effective or productive, but because that generation, that's their native language. What I would say to individuals, I'm going to first look at what generation are you in? Because something can do it, shouldn't you use it? I
Yeah.
agree to a point as to if you don't take the time to consider why am I using it? How does it enhance the outcome of what I'm doing this for? Or am I just doing it because it's easier and there's a shortcut? That's where leadership, management, and ownership, as from a work standpoint, really has to really think about how are we going to utilize these tools? What are our standards? What are our expectations? Because there's going to hit a platform where, or a level where you still have to have human interaction. You still have to have that employee or that individual there. So, what are we using to enhance customer experience, workforce experience, productivity, profitability, all of those kind of things, as most businesses do? Also, what we see it for is how do we use it to understand the human element in the workplace? Because if you use it for the right ways, like any tool, it doesn't matter, any tool, then you can improve the expectations not only faster, but more accurately. But without guardrails, without understanding of biases, understanding of end goals, then it can go amok. Look at the dot-com boom. All of a sudden, the internet exploded. This is exactly what's happening with AI, but faster and more compressed than you saw. There was a course correction. Inevitably, I think what's the third thing that's happening in the marketplace that has never occurred in the past is that technology is one of those things that there's got to be, or there's going to be a single owner or a single winner, where usually it's competitive. When you look at the difference between Apple or Microsoft, Apple wanted to be in one place, one single system. Microsoft wanted to be able to be duplicated in multiple systems. There's going to be a race for AI where eventually there's going to be one primary provider. And then that's going to really start to dictate how and what we use it, just like a Mac versus a PC. When you take all of that in context, you really not just think about it the big picture, but how
Right.
decisions are being made around that, not only through generational, but through the labor force, and
Mm.
why no matter what you do, AI will be part of that, not because of just profitability, but because there's less and less people working in a traditional environment. And there's going to have to be a hybrid between vendors, the gig economy, and your traditional workforce.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit on some of this, Rico, but I also think it's really, really exciting. First thing I want to tackle is you mentioned shortcuts. I think that's an important conversation. I interpret shortcuts as making a mistake with AI, like
Okay.
plain and simple. So for example, I had ChatGPT on my phone and was trying to wordsmith like a post, like a social media post. And my son walked up and he's like, "That's cheating, Dad. My teacher told me that you're cheating. You need to be able to know how to use a comma and a semicolon." And for the life of me, I still struggle with semicolons to this day.
Same here.
There was a study done that critical thinking skills were going down.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes you hear those studies and there's other studies that counteract studies and you never know which one to pick. In your professional opinion, where is the right time? Kind of getting a driver's license. Should somebody start leveraging AI? And we can use a micro example as like a kid. Like a kid should know how to write a sentence, subject, predicate. He shouldn't be using AI yet because he doesn't know those fundamentals. Kind of like in comedy, before you can break the rules, you got to know the rules I was taught. Then you kind of speak from that lens of like, here are the mistakes we're making with it very quickly that if people avoided these, they could accelerate their education around AI even faster to really put fuel on the speed of their projects, help their people, etc.
It's a very interesting question because fundamentally you're correct. We should know the fundamental. My first language is Spanish, so I
Okay.
spell as it sounds. I've never been able to write. I always remember my English teacher, everything in red. Great body, but the spelling sucks. So the thing is that unfortunately, English, if it's your second language, it's still a difficult language to speak and to write. I use AI to fix those things because it makes it a lot easier. Because the perception, if you send an email or an article that is misspelled and punctuations, all of that goes out the window. What I do uh, uh, fundamentally disagree with, first of all, look at how many people look at texting, look at current language. You know, none of the original rules that you and I grew up with are being used today anyway. Let's
Well,
get
that's a
that
good
out
point.
there.
Wells and emojis.
Right.
Okay, I'm with you.
But I just saw a study back to the cognitive thinking and things of that nature.
Yeah,
What ends up happening is that if we don't use our natural creativity, our natural curiosity to create the body of work. Say if you're writing an article, then what the research is showing is that more and more people are connecting with articles and letters and emails that are written in human with all those errors
yeah.
because now it feels disingenuine. This is not you. I've never heard you say these words, you know, all of that stuff, right? So there's got to, again, back to a balance. You know, when I write articles and I'm writing my third book now, I put my ideas and I want to see can chat or whatever system I use can help organize it in a way that my natural ideas are still being presented in a way that everyone understands it because I can tend to be too clinical. But
Yeah.
it doesn't change the essence. I'm not using it to write the book and in editing. And I think
Right.
there's going to come a time where as human beings, we're tribal. We're always looking for that genuine article. When you and I speak, I want to speak to Paul. I don't want to speak to
Yeah.
Paul's AI. That's
Right.
perfect, right? Because
Right.
we do not like perfection. We're always looking for those nuances. The drop of social skills as connection as communication, as well as the drop of communication skills as just writing and communicating your own personal thoughts, that if you can still do that, that's going to be an advantage. That is going to separate you because people are now recognizing what it looks like in ChatGPT, what it
Yeah.
looks like, even if you try to humanize it. My concern is that you start losing your identity, your creativity, your uniqueness, because everyone is using a very similar tool that speaks in a similar way, even though you can tweak it and everything else, that eventually becomes whitewashed. And again, that goes back to the guardrails. How do we use these tools to enhance human experience, not replace it?
I want to talk about Remy because and the reason I want to bring up Remy is because this is your system or tool. What's the right for? Let's not let AI dictate the words. Let's us dictate the words. I was using AI the other day and it used a word I've never heard of, and I'm like,
Right.
I don't even know what that means. So, is it? Is a system? Is that the right terminology, or is it
It's a
different?
behavior analysis engine. So again,
Okay,
the best way to
behavioral
talk about it
analysis
is
engine.
if you think about ChatGPT, it's a large language model. So what we did is create something similar that is based on behavioral analytics. So it's
Okay,
interactive. You can plug in your assessments. One of the things I do, especially for candidates that are looking for a job, we can
yeah,
take your LinkedIn profile, put it into Remy, and it'll provide me a 10-page profile of you just from your LinkedIn profile. How you
really,
communicate, how you make decisions, what are your adjectives, what conversations to have, what questions to ask. Because we've really trained it to understand the behavioral element of that conversation, not to
right,
replace it. So it gives you tools to do that. And what we wanted to do is not to just create ask a question, get an answer. What we designed behind it is that we put close to almost 2 terabytes of psychological data. Think of every assessment, every behavioral, psychological. We use stuff from the FBI and the CIA. We use
yeah,
things that are business. I mean, everything to give it a repository of knowledge. And what it does uniquely, it doesn't just go, this is the question, let me find where the answer is and give it back. It goes across all of the data and it finds all those little pieces of data that to you and I would be irrelevant and deduce the best answer around across all factions that are relevant to what you're asking. We just did one for a client that just promoted 5 different managers that have been in that company for almost 12 years since the inception. Well, 3 of them are failing horribly, even though they're in the same job. So we use their assessment, we put it into Remy, and it can create a predictable index as to why are they failing, how much productivity would they have if you gave them the right training, but more importantly, from both a cultural, behavioral, and emotional component, what is the struggle? And immediately when they read that, they saw exactly why these 3 people were struggling. And one of the key reasons was that they were very good at their job. They're very analytical. They're
right.
very good with one-on-one, but immediately company just doubled in employees. It went from 10 to 25 and then next year to 80. And now this person goes from working by themselves to being in charge of 8 people instantly. So they're struggling. And that's not something that they can naturally adapt to. And that's the key here is what is your natural aptitude and abilities, not your skill. That's why it's so important that when you're hiring, we hire from a transactional point of view. You have a job that requires a certain amount of skill and a certain experience. You put a job description that is looking for that skill and that experience. You interview to see if how they relate has a lot to do with the skill and experience. But
Correct.
they quit for all the reasons that had nothing to do with a transactional component. Because here's what they're not thinking about. What culture am I putting them in? What leadership style will they be under? Who are they working with? what is the responsibility of this role as far as outside of skill? Meaning, is this a fast paced role? Is this a customer facing role? Is this an analytical role? What is some of the key components of that? And then we add skill and experience to it. And when we start adding Remy to that, you could start seeing a much bigger picture. We let the role dictate what kind of candidate we need. And that's where we really supersede, because then the job description is written differently. The interview questions are different. Like, for example, we just did this for a large organization, and they have a very unique culture. It's a very driven culture. So they need a very unique type of individual. So we changed the questions. I'll pose this question to you, Paul, and you tell me how you would answer it.
Let's do it. Let's do this.
So it is Christmas Eve. You're with your family. Your biggest client calls you and says they have no access to their account and they need access to close the biggest deal ever. The problem is you have no idea how to walk them through to open that account, but you know who does. Happens to be a good friend of yours who's away on their honeymoon. What do you do?
The first thing I do is the customer ideally would come first. Since Christmas is every year, I would prioritize the client for the needs of the business, because just like a family or a person, that's what a business ideally is. It's like a baby. You have to feed it. So my first step would be to call the best person, the parent of this problem, to help us overcome that obstacle, so that way they too can enjoy their holiday season just like I have the privilege to of where I work. Like, that's how I would
Right.
personally answer that
And
question.
again,
By the way, didn't have a script. That was
no,
pretty
no,
good, I
but see,
felt.
that's
Yeah.
the beauty is
Yeah.
we're not hiring just for skill and experience. When you start understanding what is the appropriate answer for that culture,
For
right?
that
Now,
culture.
for
Okay.
the cultures, there's some companies go, oh, sorry, Mr. or Mrs. Client, we're on vacation. You have to wait. But there's some customers, some workplaces that's the exact answer. So what we look at is choice and decision making that defines the character that fits that culture. And it's
Choice and
not something
decision
you would
making.
normally think about. It's almost an unspoken rule, but then you get in trouble for not doing the right things that no one told you you should. But if we put that on the front end and we design 30 to 40 questions that are cultural, character, decision, and application based, now you can say this person skill can be taught, but this person fits into the ethos of who we are as an organization. Some of them are family oriented. Some of them are, you have to be almost crazy to work here because we want people that are going to do whatever it takes to win. Now you have the right person that naturally fits into that culture, who naturally wants to be there.
Remy seems really unique to me.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, this is the first time I've heard of it, because I know we've just been so busy, it's hard to nail down time. But of all the sea of AI, it seems really niche.
Yes.
And what I'm interpreting you to say is, with Remy, what it does is it expedites to kind of bring that candidate to get that information up front. So you get the qualified candidate based on their responses, and to see if it aligns with the job description and culture fit. Like, that's what it does. And I think that's really, really cool. And the reason I think that's really cool, and I'm not just saying that because you're my friend, you're a guest on my podcast, Rico. There's stories out there of people saying that this AI tool was banned. Now, I don't read every article. It's impossible. The CEO of Google said we consume 44% more information. I did an interview once, and the interview would like measure my eyes to see if I was making like good eye contact. And one AI system supposedly got in trouble because if somebody comes from a different cultural background, where maybe that's genetically not born that way, well, now technically you have a racist AI kind
Right.
of, and that case study that got in trouble. So I'm assuming that's not part of Remy, correct? I just want to be very, very clear.
Yeah.
Okay, because I like the tool. What are some things that, if I recall correctly, AI we have to use to a certain point until a person gets involved, to use it responsibly? You've coached me on this. You've helped me understand this. Give me an example without Remy it would have cost the company something. Like, hey, without using this, here's what we're losing.
That's a big reason why we started it, because I kept seeing the same mistakes over and over and over again. I mean, on average, companies flush $22 to $50,000 of salary with the wrong person. And I wanted to ask, I kept asking the question, if I keep looking at a Gallup poll and we have
Yeah.
this very same similar reasons why people are leaving year over year over year, well, why are we not improving at the front end? And that's where most of the money is lost, on the hiring and the 90-day onboarding. That's where most of the business is lost, because HR is so overwhelmed. They're just trying to get numbers. Then they hire a recruiting company. All the recruiting company cares about is having that person placed for 90 days so I can keep my money. And all they're using is a job description that is very transactional. So simple companies that have done this, and there's across the board, but one in particular that I've worked with had a 40% turnover rate. And these are your
Holy
middle
smokes.
managers, and you're talking about anywhere between $100,000 to $225,000, per position. And they couldn't understand why. They're the most qualified, or they have the most skill, the most experience. They came from another company. What is it? And when we
Right.
walked in, and to address the whole issue of the biases, what we designed for Remy is that you don't even get to see the person. This is all based on a position, a culture. We go and we interview the decision makers, the support staff. We want to walk into the culture and understand it as a whole, so that we're talking about the role. See, that's the difference that we approach. We come from the role first, not
Role
the
first,
person,
not
right?
the person. Okay.
Correct.
Very important. That's a really important distinction that you
Huge,
just highlight. I like that a lot.
right? So it's
Yeah.
a fit first, or what is the role need? If you treated the role as a human being and it needed instructions, what are those? Why was the role
Okay. I
created?
like that.
What are the key features that makes this role successful, right? What has to happen? What is the ideal environment for this role to thrive in? What could derail it? Well, we take all of that in consideration, and that is our approach. So as we go out, you don't even see the person or even talk to the person until you've narrowed it down to the top 5 candidates that have a 93 or higher gap report or connection to that benchmark. We create a benchmark of the role, and then provide HR or recruiting with tools to identify very quickly, based through their resumes, who is a good fit to take to the next level. So by the time the HR or the recruiter is speaking, they're speaking to the very top 5 individuals who already meet 93 or more of the benchmark necessities naturally. And then we
Okay.
give them interview questions. And now all of this that we've designed is in accordance with EEOC. So there's no bias, because it's not about the person, it's about the role. But we've
Right.
had
Love
third
it.
party validations. We've had it go through the EEOC to make sure that there's no bias whatsoever. And we've actually built in anti bias systems into Remy, that it
Really?
doesn't look at the human as far as the person itself, but how does the answers, criteria, and the data fit the benchmark?
All right. I love that. That's cool.
When we go into an interview, there's very specific character, decision making, skills, and experience. And then we take the transcript and we put that into Remy. And we want to make sure that there's a balance there. Again, the,
Right.
the end user has not met the person yet. This is all
Right.
data and analytics. So when we're done, we say, here's the top 3 candidates that we see fit. Here's the advantages we see. Here's how we see they're aligned to what you're doing. Here's some of the things you're going to have to do to make sure they're enhanced. This is what you need to do to shorten the learning curve. Here's some challenges you might have based on these things. Who would you like to choose? And only then do they get to see the person.
I am interested in something. And there's a lot you've said. You've talked about, we've mentioned the word transactional a lot, efficiency. And I think part of that, I personally feel part of that is because of how much impact Amazon has had.
Yeah.
Like, we're kind of really baby. Like, you can click your phone, you can get groceries, you can click your phone, you can get a steak, whatever. You get the
Yeah.
analogy. Insert technological analogy. Here's why I'm mentioning that to segue into this. How easy is it for somebody to onboard with such an advanced system like Remy? There you go. That's my question. Even though that wasn't on my guide, I'm like, I'm going to ask it just because I'm super excited.
It's easy, but I wouldn't say necessarily simple, and here's why. In order to
Okay.
do it right, you have to take some front steps forward that are not used to in the most organizations. What do I mean by that? Taking the time to have a face-to-face interview with decision makers, support systems, with subject matter experts that truly understand, taking time to create what we call a benchmark. Let's talk about the role. That takes about an hour, hour and a half. Once the front end things are done, then it gets very easy because it's just plug and play. Because we're
Nice.
only
Plug and
using
play.
the analytics of that front end information. I'm looking at some of the stats that we have here. Clients who have used this, for example, we had a 940% ROI in call center pilot turnover. We cut that down
Wow.
in 50% in 2 weeks. We have a
2 weeks.
93% predictable accuracy across 40 years of validation, studies, and EOC compliance. And within 2 weeks, you can have a really clear understanding of what is the role, why is it important, who do I need to hire, and how do I decide? What I find most difficult is clients giving me time, having the time to interview, and them wanting to taking the time for them to understand why this is important. Because as you just said, you get comfortable at ordering everything on Amazon or Uber Eats, or we get into that cycle, and it's very challenging to change. But once you experience the change, you see, oh, wow, this is a lot more efficient. When you're saving 25 to 45% of lost revenue because of hiring the wrong person, that's the tangible cost. The intangible is how you fractured the team, the chaos that you created, the toxicity you now have to deal with, the customers that you lost, all of that. And technology is not going to fix that. There's still going to be another human being, which goes back to what I said earlier. The baby boomers are coming out of the workforce. Guess what they're becoming now? The future customers. So if you
That's
don't,
a really good
if you
catch.
can't train your teams to deal with baby boomers and you're expecting technology, which baby boomers tend to struggle with, you're going to have a hard time. We got to
Wow.
take all of that in consideration that most organizations struggle with, especially those mid-level companies, 25 to 100 employees that are moving very quickly, trying to keep up. Taking the time to look at not just that role, but the culture, the infrastructure, and the trends. So now you can make better decisions for the next 5 years versus what I need right now. And that is also true with succession planning. Another reason we designed this was, especially during the pandemic, I was having to train brand new managers who had never managed before, who are now in charge of a team that half of them are in Europe and the half is US via Zoom, and no one's given them any training on how to manage.
Hmm.
And they're wondering why they're struggling. And because it was what ended up happening was, oh, you're our top performer. Can you make other people do what you do? Congratulations. There you go. But But now we can say, okay, this person does have the ability and skill, but they are going to require this level of training so they meet your standards. And this is the predictable analysis that if you do, they'll improve by 60, 70, 80%, right? Or that person is promotable, but not in that position. They need to come over here. So it really is a co-pilot for businesses and HR that things that you're not thinking about, things that bite you in the butt down the road,
Yeah.
you can now understand ahead of time
Yeah.
when you utilize it correctly. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish here is how do science meet the human experience in the workplace where you can make better decisions,
Right.
improve the culture of your people, be more predictable in what you decide, and minimize your errors.
Yeah.
Humans make errors, especially under pressure. But if you have something to say, okay, based on the information you're giving me, here's our recommendation. Now you can make better decisions that affects not only you, but the other human being at the end of that conversation.
What are you most excited about? What are your predictions of where it's going to go and how it's going to help society? Number one. Number two, what do you like to do for fun outside of AI? Because sometimes some of this
I know.
AI talk is like, holy smokes, like, can I just go get a steak?
Yeah. What am I most excited about is that we have an opportunity, the first time in human history, to improve our quality of life, our understanding of each other. How do we add value in a way that is not messy? And that's what I think technology can assist, just like the phone, like the car, and anything else. I've seen so many people that we're not artists, but we're so creative that are not using AI to be creative. There's a lot of value when used appropriately. One of my biggest concerns is that every younger generation is struggling with social skills, and we are tribal in nature. And I've seen so
Yeah,
much loneliness, so
true.
much stress, so much challenges with relationships, especially younger, because they're used to texting. And we are not wired for that, just that level of interaction. So if we can utilize technology to improve the how-tos that
Right.
improve natural connection, I'm excited about that. We're starting a program with schools where we're going to take some of the same ideas as they do for professional sports and find kids that are talented or that have different skill sets, and using
Oh, really?
AI to connect to potential employers that will sponsor them through their
Oh,
educational
that's so
journey.
cool.
And
Yeah.
through AI, we're able to do those things and help them and coach them and train them. I think as we get older in generation, it is our responsibility to pass on our knowledge, but we have to use the right skill sets to do that. So I'm excited about that. And I'm really, really excited about how, as connected as we are in technology, that the conversation is reverting back to how do we still connected as a community, as individuals, as people, because science is showing that health, longevity, community requires interaction between people that is not electronically based. And when you look at what they call blue zones, people who are living over 100 years, one of the key components of that was they're the group of individuals that have stayed together for years. And that's how we're wired. So science is really justifying the need for more human to human connection out of technology. So that is one of the things we want to do. Yeah, we want to be part of that revolution, not just about how to make life easier, but how do we connect people more effectively? What do I do outside of AI? One of my passions is cooking, because back to, when one of my joys is Thanksgiving, because I do all the cooking, all the family shows up, and my proudest moment is when everyone's sitting at the table and I'm looking at all the family interacting, no phones or whatever. Food has that power of bringing people together and to communicate and to interact and to socialize. So I use food in that medium. So I love doing that and making people happy through appetite and food and, things of that nature.
Well, I know whose house I'm going to for
Yeah.
Thanksgiving next year.
More
That's
than
for
welcome.
sure.
Absolutely. It's
So I want to thank you
absolutely.
again for taking the time. For those, definitely check out
Q.inc.com.
Q.inc. Correct.
YouTube, WTF, What's the Fix on YouTube. Check that out. And then on LinkedIn, Rico Peña, please drop a comment. And for your listeners, if they go on LinkedIn and mention your podcast, we'll put them on the waiting list for when our book comes out. They'll get a free copy.